Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, and welcome to episode 616 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the last 11 stories from the book The Best of Kim Stanley Robinson. And those stories are The Translator, Glacier, The Lunatics, Zurich, Vinland the Dream, A History of the 20th Century with Illustrations, Muir, Shasta, Sexual Dimorphism, Discovering Life, Prometheus Unbound at Last, and The Timpanist of the Berlin Philharmonic, 1942. And this will include spoilers for all of those stories, so just be aware of that. And this is a follow-up to our discussion of the first half of The Best of Kim Stanley Robinson back in episode 613, so definitely check that out if you missed it. And I'm joined today by my good friend Anthony Ha, making his 36th appearance on the show. He's the weekend editor at TechCrunch and a co-host of the podcast Original Content, and his short fiction appears in Asimov's and Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet, and in the chapbook Love Songs for Monsters. His story The Tourists will be appearing in an upcoming issue of Asimov's. And now here's our interview with Anthony Ha. All right, so we're here with Anthony Ha. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
Okay, so the first story in batch 2 is called The Translator. And so in this story, it's set on an alien planet, and there's a small human settlement there. And the main character is this guy, Owen Rumford. He's like the mayor and bartender and mailman for this community. Since it's such a small community, he plays a lot of roles. And in his capacity as bartender, he sometimes serves aliens. And so he has this kind of broken down old translator device that can only translate between 2 languages at a time. And so the inciting incident is that these 2 rival gangs of aliens show up, the Barney and the Igloss. And the Barney are like sea hippos, and the Igloss are like slime vultures. And they are planning to, it turns out every 250 years or something, they fight some ritual battle on this planet, which he's afraid is going to decimate this human settlement. And so he has to figure out how he's going to deal with that. Oh, and they need him to, for some reason, they need him to translate between them. So he's using his junky translator to talk to these 2 different groups of aliens. So, Anthony, what did you think of The Translator?
I enjoyed this story. It felt, I think partly because it is so different from pretty much every other story in this collection. I don't think that, off the top of my head at least, I don't think there's any other kind of like far future space-based kind of almost space opera stories. Although, I mean, the scope of this is not really space opera scope, but it has that kind of feeling of like a, almost kind of Star Trek or Galactic Empire type future. And it's this, there are obviously like high stakes for the characters, but the whole thing is treated almost like a romp in this way that I enjoyed. I think that I definitely have some questions about the logic of, you already alluded to the fact that I don't really understand how these 2 alien races can have, this incredibly regular ritual conflict over the centuries when they can't communicate with each other at all. And there's certain other things where I'm like, I don't quite get it, but it just is sort of like a fun, diverting story, almost a lark. I did like it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you make, that this may be the only story in the collection. I'm just trying to look over the list here that's set on an alien planet. Is that, or like set outside the solar system? I think that's right.
I'm looking now too, yeah.
But yeah. So, but that was definitely a head scratcher for me. I mean, because also these Igloss aliens. I have a line here. It says he had dealt with the Igloss before. They came from the next planet in and used Rannoch Station as a trade center. So it seems like if these aliens are coming regularly to this, like bouncing regularly around planets to trade, it seems really weird to me that they don't have their own translator. So yeah, I feel like unless there's something I'm missing, I feel like you just kind of have to go with this premise that these aliens need him to translate between them for some reason. But that was definitely a little bit weird. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so basically he's like, okay, well, I don't want them to blow up this planet with their war. So he tries to trick them by lying to each set of aliens about what the other is saying to try to postpone the hostilities. And that was like fun. I think. Did you describe the story as a romp or something like that?
Yeah,
it's
something
definitely
like
sort of silly. I mean, you either have to take this as just sort of a comedic story, or assume that these aliens are extremely credulous. But yeah, so that was another thing. I was like, really, these aliens aren't seeing through this, what seems to be a fairly transparent deception on his part. But yeah, I think you just kind of have to take it as a not totally serious story. Is that how do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think, it's not to say that there's no like kind of, that it's totally like a departure from, realism, but yeah, fundamentally, I think it's meant to be humorous. I think, the parts that are interesting to me from that aren't just about how funny he can make it are, although it is quite funny, is the description of this translator device and the fact that, you don't just have this kind of magical translation, but that he's sort of, it's the digital equivalent of just kind of frantically flipping through the pages of a dictionary and being like, what the hell are they talking about? And then getting these very contradictory definitions, which is both funny, although I think, like some of the other jokes I think we talked about in the in our previous episode about Escape from Kathmandu, I think actually this was the story where I felt more just that he was kind of hitting the same joke over and over again. But even so, I still enjoyed it and found it like pretty funny and entertaining in general.
Well, yeah, let me talk about some of the things I liked about the story. I thought the one real strength of it was that it portrayed these aliens as convincingly alien, that I think a lot of science fiction, maybe that Robinson is sort of thinking of and responding to, is kind of like, like the Star Trek phenomenon where you just have the aliens, but they basically just seem human with pointy ears or ridged foreheads or whatever it is. And it's totally straightforward to translate. You can just have your universal translator device on your starship and it translates everything perfectly, and there's no communications difficulties or ambiguities or anything like that. And so like the physical descriptions of these aliens are really, they seem very alien and kind of different or original. But then this issue of if you were translating an actual alien language, wouldn't it be even more difficult to translate than just a foreign human language? And Robinson says in his author's note that this story was inspired by studying German, and he would look up some German word in his English-German dictionary, and there would be like 7 definitions, none of which seemed to have anything to do with each other. And I think he says he took some of these lists of seemingly unrelated words and just used them in this story because they were kind of funny. So yeah, I think like the way the story portrays the aliens, aside from how kind of credulous they are, as I said, is really good and is a real strength of the story. So yeah, but overall the story was okay to me. I thought it just lacked, like a lot of Robinson stories that we're going to get to, I just thought it kind of lacked drama. I thought that there should have been, there are some sort of vague complications where he says to the aliens like, oh, we have to postpone or else these other aliens are going to blow up your planet, which isn't true, and sort of like talks himself into potentially increasing the hostilities when he's trying to defuse them. But I thought the story could have amped that up. Like his whole, deception seems to just play out pretty smoothly for the most part, and the whole story is just it just seems pretty easy for him to trick these aliens and get them to go away. And I thought it could have used some more twists or complications or something.
Yeah, there's actually a brief moment where one of the alien races, I think the ones that look more like vultures, they seem to actually be saying something about the translator and insulting the translator because they're starting to catch on. And I think that is a thread that could have been developed in a much more interesting way, but it just kind of gets dropped after that. And then it, like you said, it just goes smoothly.
Yeah, I guess the other thing is that Robinson gives us, I think, every exchange, verbatim, and both aliens are pretty. It's pretty hard to parse. I mean, one more so than the other, but it's pretty hard to parse what they're saying. And so it was just to me a little bit exhausting reading paragraph after paragraph of gibberish. Just as a reader, I thought that could have been streamlined a little bit, because I guess you were saying he sort of hits the same joke over and over again. I don't know if that's what you're.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah. It just I thought less. There could have been a less is more kind of approach to that.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's interesting what you were talking about with the drama too, because I think in some of the other stories, both in the first half, but I think particularly some of the other stories we'll be talking about in a few minutes, there's not a lot of drama in the sense that there aren't sort of traditional science fiction stakes, right? And even though some of these stories I like quite a bit, there's no real there's not like a big conflict. There's not like a big dramatic change in the course of the story. It's more just sort of describing a world or a situation. And this is in some ways much more traditional, because there's a town that could get blown up by these aliens, and this guy is, frantically trying to prevent that. So in that sense, there's much more traditional adventure story stakes. And yet in some ways it feels like one of the lowest stakes stories in the collection, because at no point do you actually really believe he's going to fail. And the whole tone of the thing again is so kind of tongue in cheek.
Yeah, and we'll get to this with the other stories, but there are a couple stories in here that are not science fiction by any definition that I would endorse. And there are a bunch more that are like maybe kind of borderline fantasy science fiction, but don't necessarily provide the kinds of, like, they don't necessarily scratch the fantasy and science fiction itch in the way that I would want. So, I mean, this is at least, clearly a science fiction story. So I appreciated that about it. But yeah, we'll get to that with some of the other stories. The other thing I'll just mention about this story is that there's this kind of like mini twist at the end. Oh, I guess one other thing I liked about the story is that the description of this alien planet I thought was really good. It's sort of described as being kind of everything shades of gray. It's this really sort of barren, lifeless sort of planet. And so I thought that description is well done. But so in the opening, the protagonist he's remembering, I guess, does he sort of remembers trees, or like half remembers trees or something from his childhood from some other planet he used to live on. And then at the end, the hippo aliens use a word that one of its definitions is tree. And so there's this implication that, maybe they're telepathic and they've been reading his mind this whole time. And so he was never tricking them. He was only ever tricking the vulture aliens, and the hippo aliens were playing along. So that was kind of like an interesting twist, but I felt like it didn't really, I felt like more could have been done with it, because it didn't, it was a nice little touch at the end, but just overall the story was just so kind of light and lacking in drama that I wish something more had been done with all those ideas. Yeah,
I feel like, I mean, again, I partly just because of where it falls in the collection, because it's different enough from the other stories. It's like just a nice change of pace, but judged on its own, I think a story of the same length that just, had maybe half the number of, extended dictionary or translation entries, but actually then develop both the side, like the hippo aliens and the vulture aliens a bit more, ultimately might have been more memorable.
Yeah, I feel like it should have been like the aliens, he thinks that he's smooth things over, and then like they come back the next day and some new complication has arisen or something. Like the fact that it all gets resolved in this one conversation, I think just made it all seem sort of just too easy and quick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, so shall we move on to the next story?
Let's do it.
Okay, so next story is called Glacier. And in this story, it's set in Boston. And the main character is a teenage boy, and his family has fled from Toronto because there are glaciers kind of making their way south and kind of enveloping the continent. And he, I guess at the beginning of the story, they had to leave their dog behind in Toronto with a friend for reasons that are not 100% clear to me. And they end up adopting a cat. And this boy also, he kind of hangs out on the glacier, and there are like gangs of kids who throw rocks at each other. And there's some drama with his parents, who work at the local university, potentially losing their jobs. And so there's this sort of very like domestic, like family drama kind of stuff set against this backdrop of this climate, some sort of climate catastrophe. So Anthony, what did you think of Glacier?
So this is one of the stories in the collection that I've read multiple times at this point, that I read for the first time, I think 20 years ago, because it was in the 30th anniversary anthology for Asimov science fiction. And I think the first time I read it, I was like, this is so boring. I really don't care about this. And every time I've returned to it, I've liked it more, which I think with a lot of these stories that we're talking about today, kind of just going in with the right expectations maybe helps a bit, because this is a story that really, there's it's just about, this family trying to adapt to life in Boston. There's this sort of these overall threats of both the glacier, and then also that seems like the government is sort of cracking down on dissent. And so there are some like bigger tensions, but really it's much more about that. Like you said, it's like about these domestic concerns. And I think if you know that going into it, or at least for me, I really enjoy just like the texture of the story, the descriptions of the, relationship between the protagonist, who's like a teenage boy, and his parents, then his relationship with the other kind of like academics his parents know, the descriptions of like the parties they throw. There are all these like really lovely things in it. And so to me, it is this like beautiful slice of life in this strange, surreal world that I ultimately liked quite a bit.
Yeah, I ended up really, really liking this story. It definitely had some of the like things that have frustrated me about other Robinson stories, which we'll get to. But just for whatever reason, I think I just really liked the main character. I mean, it's funny that it's this story about like glaciers enveloping North America, or that's the world that we're in. And the most dramatic thing that happens in this story is a boy rescues a cat from a tree. That's like the big climax of the story. But somehow it works pretty well, and there's these sort of implications of more drama. Like there's this guy who seems to be, the main character's parents have these little like parties where they get together and discuss politics and stuff. And it seems like maybe there's somebody spying on them. And there's this implication that maybe, the reason that they're getting fired from the university is because their little parties are seen as subversive or something. And, there's this, I mentioned there's these gangs of boys who throw rocks at each other on the glacier. And it seems like maybe something, more dramatic will happen with that, and never does. There are all these sort of like things that you think might be dramatic that never really pay off. But overall, I thought the story was so likable that it didn't end up bothering me that much. I think that, having already read a bunch of Robinson stories, I kind of had this sense that, he's just not the kind of person who is necessarily going to have, something super dramatic happen at the end of the story. So I wasn't too thrown by that. But I did feel like I like some of the other stories that we've talked about, I wish that he had clarified exactly what was going on in this world early on in the story, because I was still sort of like why are the glaciers moving south? Is this some scientific climate scenario? Is this like just like a magical, metaphor? It wasn't totally clear to me. And even like I mentioned, like where they had to leave their dog behind in Toronto. I mean, it is not that far from Toronto to Boston. So I was like, why did they have to leave the dog behind? Was it some, was it like it was hard to get the dog across the border or like something? I just there was like I just had a lot of questions early on in the story that I felt like it would have only improved the story to have clarified that the story did not benefit in any way from leaving so much ambiguous at the start.
I agree. I mean, I think that I can understand sort of leaving out the origin, or maybe that because on some level I don't know that it's a particularly plausible or scientific thing to happen. Or I mean, I could be wrong. But that, any explanation would just sort of be a little unsatisfying. But I think, yeah, it still probably would have benefited from including it, just having somebody mentioning it in passing at some point. And more, I think, to some of the questions you had, I don't care as much about like why it's happening as just like how long has this been going on for? Have they sort of known for his entire life? Has he thought that he was going to be sort of fleeing south from the glaciers, or is that something that's only happened in the last few years? Is this a situation where everybody expects they're just going to all end up kind of clustered around the equator at some point? That they're just kind of questions about time and, his own, everyone's relationship to the glaciers that's not very clear to me. That, I mean, I think, yeah, I think there's certain things that just could have been clear. I mean, it's a story that does in some ways benefit from ambiguity. Like, I don't necessarily need the kind of role of this kind of repressive government to be spelled out more, or to have that guy who'd been like watching him come back more explicitly later. But I think just some more sense of just like, yeah. And I had the same thought with the animals, where it's like, why do they have to leave the dog behind? And then why are they leaving? The mom at one point says, we can't, but she doesn't really explain why they can't bring the cat along. So it just feels, it also just makes them feel like they're very willing to just, abandon their pets at the slightest provocation.
Yeah, well, and it's not like this is this is a key, like the fact that they had to leave these animals behind is like the ending of the story. Mm-hmm. So it's like the fact that you're puzzled over why they can't just take a cat from Boston to Kansas, is an issue if that's the whole emotional thrust of the last scene of the story. And I don't need like a description of the physics of how the glaciers are moving south, which, may not ever be satisfying. But I feel like I do need to know like where, I agree with you. How long have the glaciers been coming? Like where roughly are they? Like when they're talking about, when the main character and his mom are talking about moving to Kansas, he's like, will there be glaciers there? And she's like, I think there's glaciers everywhere. And I'm like, wait, how can there be glaciers? Like what? Like
I have questions.
Like, is she just being kind of like defeatist, or are there literally glaciers everywhere? And like, how is that just geographically possible? Like, so yeah, I just, and that's why I wonder, like, are we meant to read this as like a magical realist story, or more so than a science fiction story? So I don't know. I just thought, yeah, there could have been some clarity on some of that, because it was just sort of like, it doesn't matter really, but it was like just a distraction for me as a reader wondering about this stuff. Whereas if there had just been like 2 sentences clarifying it, I could have just moved on and focused on the characters and the atmosphere and what the story is really about.
I did want to mention, though, that I do think the actual descriptions of the glacier are really beautiful and strange. And the descriptions of like when he like climbs, over the glacier and kind of has his own hiding place, but also like how people have tried to like stop the glacier in the past and just kind of rolled over these metal bars and bent them. I thought they had this really nice combination of it. You get the sense of the immensity and how surreal it would all be compared to how, we see Boston now. But at the same time, that they've sort of adapted to it and they're sort of used to seeing these giant walls of ice.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about how Robinson is so good on description, and he's actually walked on glaciers, I think he mentions in his author's notes. So, I mean, he definitely knows what it's like to walk on a glacier, and provides a lot of detail about that. I wasn't sure I could ever exactly visualize what this glacier this glacier in Boston actually looked like. But so I'm kind of two minds of that a little bit. Like, his description is very of like the texture of the ice and that kind of stuff is really, really good. But then in terms of like, what does this actually look like? If you're looking at it from a distance off, I was never exactly sure what I was meant to be picturing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I guess I just wanted some more clarity. But like I said, overall, I really liked this story, and I think it's just a testament to his ability to write characters. Because I did love this character. Alex, isn't it? I really like this character, Alex. Yeah, like you said, the way he'll hang out on the glacier, and these parties that his parents throw, and he cares so much about this cat. I mean, it. I think in contrast to maybe some of the other stories where they had some of the same weaknesses, but I didn't like the characters as much. That we'll get to. This one, the main character really won me over, and just made me really enjoy the story, even with all the kind of niggling issues I had with it.
I really liked his parents too. I mean, I liked him, but I liked them as a family unit.
Yeah, and there's this whole sort of subplot where he has to sell the family books and stuff, and yeah, they were very, very believable as kind of likable academic types, just trying to survive in this really kind of slowly crumbling, because it's not like it's not like a full out like post-apocalyptic like Mad Max kind of setting. It's this very sort of, there's this sort of slow disintegration of institutions, and everything's just kind of slowly breaking down to the extent that it feels normal to Alex, because this is like what he's grown up with. But to us, we see how how repressive the government is, and how disastrous the environment is, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Shall we move on to story number 3?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So story number 3 is called The Lunatics. And so, yeah, what was going on in the story was not 100% clear to me. But basically you have these miners on the moon, and they're mining an element called promethium. And as the story goes on, we find out that they're sort of like, there's this, like some sort of repressive society on the moon where the elites live in these domed cities and have wine and fountains and stuff like that. And the common people are sort of oppressed and sent to the mines if they step out of line. And there are these characters called foremen, who are like robots, they're like robot overseers who whip the miners, and the miners are kept in total darkness pretty much all the time. And they there's like there, and as the story opens, the miners have started disappearing one by one in the darkness. And there's rumors that there's some sort of monster in the mines hunting them. So I think that's enough to start us off with. So Anthony, what did you think of The Lunatics?
I did like it, but I also was very confused. And I've now read this story twice, and I think both times it just is like really hard to figure out what is going on at the beginning, for like a variety of reasons. One, like you said, is that there's essentially no natural light in this in the mines, and no, I think, and like only very, very select usage of any lights at all. So most of this story just takes place in complete darkness. And also that there is this character who has kind of become recently, I think, joined and sort of taken over this group of miners, and he is this sort of like mystic. And so he's talking about opening your third eye, and like, the power of the, like, ingesting small amounts of promethium, which will kill you in large doses, but in small doses will actually open your third eye. And
And allow you to see in the dark.
Exactly. And then and people do it, and then they, at least the narrator describes it as if he can see in the dark, and
or see sort of see in the see like red fuzzy shapes or something.
Yeah.
So you're not sure, is this just his? Yeah, you're with this third eye thing. So you're not sure, is this is the guy crazy and everyone's just succumbing to his power of suggestion, and the main character is just seeing floaters and stuff like that and thinking that he's actually seeing something that's actually there? Or is there something supernatural going on? Or is something scientific going on? And it's not at all clear to me exactly what we're supposed to make of the third eye thing in this story.
Yeah, exactly. I think ultimately I chose to read it as that, it really wasn't working, and this guy was sort of a sham, but that, he still provided value in sort of bringing the group together and giving them solidarity and giving them purpose. But I think you could read the story either way, and I think the story in some way is meant to be read with that openness of interpretation, which is fine, I guess, but makes for a particularly disorienting beginning where you're just like, who are all the, and also because it starts in this group scene, so you're just like, who are all these people? Where are they? Then I think once I figured out what was going on, the sort of main plot of, the miners disappearing and ultimately realizing that they've been escaping, and then that they're trying to kind of get away from the overseers was pretty gripping, and then the ending.
Well, wait. Before we got a lot more. We got a lot more to explain before we get to the ending. I mean, so this guy Jacob, who you mentioned is kind of like the mystic leader of this group, he has a couple other weird things he says. So he's got the third eye thing, and then he also talks about the mind of the moon. So they're like I mentioned, they're mining promethium. But he somehow is talking about as if the moon is conscious, and promethium is its network of synapses or something. And by mining it, they're destroying the minds of the moon. But since they're ingesting the promethium also, it's they're taking the mind of the moon into themselves and becoming the new mind of the moon or something. And I was never sure whether to take that as, as just crazy talk or whether that actually is happening somehow. Do you have any idea, having read this twice?
No, I mean, also and then there's this whole other thing about there's that it seemed that Oliver, the protagonist, he was also hearing things in the mind that maybe were that he thought that later on you think, oh no, those were the other miners, but actually they say it wasn't them. So I don't know. So there's a lot of things where I'm just I don't really know what was going on with that, including a lot of the stuff that Jacob claims, which also just creates this confusion because he's talking about also that he can remember Earth because this weird accident happened to him, but nobody else can remember it. And again, it just sort of increases
because they all had their memories erased by their captors.
Yes, and Jacob said, "Oh, I had something happened to my I forget, it's basically a sharp stick went into his brain and changed his brain enough that he could remember more than everyone else." Which again, I wasn't sure how literally to take that.
I actually thought that was really cool. I mean, I think we're meant to take that literally. That they have some process that burns out the memory center of your brain or something. And because he had this accident, that part of his brain had already been destroyed. So the brain had rerouted stuff around so that when they burned it out, he was able to retain most of his memories. I actually thought that was pretty cool. I'm going to choose to believe that is literally true. Although that's an interesting interpretation if that's just another one of his crazy things and he doesn't actually remember Earth. But I feel he says stuff that does seem like he does actually remember more than other people do. I'm not. I'd have to go back and read it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, it's that I think a lot of that, how you look at Jacob, is very, very open to interpretation, and I think ultimately I'm okay with that. But it especially at the beginning, it's a big ask because you're also just trying to figure out what this world is and what the rules are.
Yeah, like just to give you an idea, what I initially thought was going on was that the entire moon had been turned into like a giant supercomputer, and they were mining, and now for whatever reason they needed the raw materials more than they needed the supercomputer, and so they were disassembling the supercomputer for its parts. I don't think that's what was happening at all, but I thought that was actually pretty cool. But yeah, and then we mentioned there's this monster potentially in the mines that Oliver thinks he sees a couple of times, or like at one point he thinks he sees like its eyes, reflecting in the darkness. And at one point he kind of hears it pass underneath him and is like, is he just crazy or like imagining things, or is there actually a monster? There's also, I think there's something about like some miner in the past had like escaped into the mines, and so maybe it's him hunting people in the darkness. Because like it eventually turns out that the reason that most of the miners have been disappearing is because they've been joining the secret like resistance off in the mines. But then like when he talks about the monster he passed, they're like, oh no, that wasn't us, that was something else. So yeah, who even knows? There's a lot of ambiguity in the story.
Right, which I think part of the defense of that would be that, none of the characters know either, that they're in the situation where they just have to kind of choose to follow Jacob and believe what he says, and there's no definitive proof one way or another whether or not he's just making all this up.
Yeah, and I don't have a problem necessarily with the story, not providing those answers or feeling dreamlike or whatever. But I do wish the story was a little bit clearer about what you like clearer about, like you mentioned in the first scene, like you're not even sure who the point of view character is. It's really, really confusing. So I wish like just simple mechanical stuff with like that was clearer, so that the stuff that's meant to be ambiguous, there was some contrast between the stuff you understood and the stuff you didn't understand.
Yeah, I think by the end I felt a little bit more grounded, so that bothered me less. But it is, I think, one of the hardest stories just to like start and get into in the collection.
Yeah. So did you notice anything the second time through that you didn't the first time, or were you just kind of like equally confused?
I think it just, I could get into it more quickly. It wasn't, I think because the first time I was just like, what the hell is going on? And I think I probably read those first 3 pages like 3 or 4 times in the first reading. And I mean, I should say that I've read all of these stories in the second half twice because I went ahead too far in advance, and we had enough time before we recorded this second episode that I was like, wait, crap, I just need to reread all of this so I can remember it. So it wasn't like, I wasn't necessarily like looking for like small details as opposed to just, okay, let me just make sure I'm like not drawing a complete blank when you bring up a story.
Yeah, so there's a lot that's ambiguous, but I think we've pretty much explained everything that you actually do know as a reader. So you started to talk about the ending. So I guess I'll explain. So eventually, Oliver is inducted into this resistance movement, and Jacob explains that their plan is they're going to like mine their way out of this mine to the surface where there's this city called Selene where the rich people all live, and they're going to escape to Selene. And so they start, like tunneling their way to Selene. So what did you think of that sequence of the story?
It was fun and interesting, and it really had sort of an energy and momentum to it. There are also some fun details there, like because they're bringing along, some livestock. Although again, I'm having trouble exactly visualizing how big is the space, like what does their actual setup look like. But there was this one moment.
Well, they have cows, right? That are like genetically engineered to be the size of dogs or something.
Oh, I had forgotten about that. Yeah. So at one point, Oliver is like, I don't know, we're going to run out of food. We're going to run out of, like, what are we going to do? And then Jacob is like, well, we can kill one of the cows. We can, like, as we move along, we can kill the cows and eat them. And everyone is just like, what? You can eat cows? That's crazy. And that was like a really nice touch. Then Jacob gets a death scene.
But like at one point, it mentions that a character picked up one of the cows, and you're like, wait, what? But then like a couple of paragraphs later, Jacob explains like, oh yeah, like on Earth the cows are really big, but we have like genetically engineered mini cows or something along those lines.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think that had just totally gone over my head. Then you have this moment where Jacob dies, and it happens fairly quickly in a way that I liked. So I liked most of that, and then at a certain point it becomes clear that some of the other miners have decided that they're going to basically just blow up and again, it's hard to figure out exactly what's going on. Is they're blowing up, I think, essentially the mechanisms that are securing this city of the elite to the moon, or possibly just blowing it up entirely. But I think actually they're just sort of, because there's this scene where they go out and they see this sort of floating thing above them. So as far as I could tell, they haven't actually just like immediately killed everyone in the city, but also maybe they have. I don't know. What did you make of that?
I thought that they had just set off a massive explosion. You know, they're using like their mining, detonator or like whatever. They're explosives that they use for mining. They have these super powerful ones, and I think they just set them off under the city, which has the effect of like expelling the city out into space. Yeah, I don't remember anything about. I don't remember like if there's like mechanisms holding the city in place.
Maybe in my head I created the mechanisms, but I just know they were at sort of like strategic points to, I guess, achieve that effect of. I mean, I would assume that's probably really bad news for the people living in the city, but didn't instantly kill all of them, maybe.
I mean, I was sufficiently confused by this story that you could say basically anything happened in it, and I would have a hard time contradicting you. But that's what I imagined, at least, was that just they set off a bunch of bombs and it blew the city off the moon, presumably killing it. I mean, I didn't expect anyone survived, but I guess I'm not sure, because it just leaves this like huge crater behind where the city used to be.
Yeah, and you talked about low conflict. I mean, obviously this is a story that has a lot of conflict, but the ending is just so there's essentially no opposition after Jacob is killed. And in the sense of like, there's no other guards, no one who seems to like notice that they're like tunneling underneath the city and planting all these bombs. So like they are able to pull off this plan with like no problems whatsoever in a way that does feel just either preposterous or dreamlike or both.
Yeah, for sure. It's a very dreamlike story. And yeah, I wasn't exactly sure what to make of the ending. I was actually a little disappointed because the two things I was kind of most interested in reading the story were like, what's the deal with this monster in the mines, and what's it going to be like when they get to the city? Like, and then you never find out anything more about the monster in the mines, and they blow up the city before you ever really see it. So the ending was a little bit of a letdown for me. One thing I did really like when they're digging this tunnel to get to the city, but then they're closing it behind them so that the guard robots can't get at them. And I thought it was interesting. I mean, I assume this is true, that if you're digging a tunnel like that, it's impossible to pack the dirt and rocks behind you as tightly as the dirt and rocks are packed ahead of you. So the space that you're working in is inevitably shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and you have to make sure you get to your destination, by a direct enough route that you don't close yourself in. I thought that was pretty cool. That was a cool detail. Like, and like the descriptions of the different kinds of rock that they're mining through had a very characteristic, believability or like detail that Robinson always has when he's writing about geography. So those were kind of some of my favorite parts of the story. But yeah, definitely overall, I thought it was just too like dreamlike and weird and confusing for me to really, totally connect with it.
I think that another thing that I did like about the ending was that kind of tone of fatalism when you realize that, well, I think Oliver asks like, well, what's going to happen now that we've blown up the city or sent it into space? And they say, well, they're either going to put us back to work or they're going to kill us. And there's sort of this sense that there was never going to be a permanent escape, right? It was all about sort of making some kind of gesture to, assert their dignity. And I think that's not a unique story, but I thought I did still find that. I'm always a sucker for that, and I found it pretty moving.
Yeah, I think like I think one reading of it is just to read it as it's all about oppression and liberation and the impossibility of true liberation from oppressive systems and stuff like that. I feel like Robinson is definitely in his kind of like, I don't know, like leftist mode writing this story. So I mean, I think some of those themes are definitely there and are interesting, but the surface level story, was just a little too off the wall for me personally. Mm-hmm. There's nothing particularly wrong with the story. But yeah, you definitely have to sort of buy into the dreamlike atmosphere, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, cool. So let's move on to our next story. It's called Zurich. And so in this story, there's an American living in Switzerland, and he and his wife have been his wife is a scientist, and so they've been living in Zurich as part of like her scientific work. But now it's time for them to move out of their apartment and go home. And he knows that in Switzerland there are these like building inspectors who come around to see how well you cleaned up your apartment, and he knows that they, that the Swiss, being all into, efficiency and everything, probably look down on the apartment cleaning abilities of Americans and are just sort of, repulsed by our slovenliness. And so he's determined he's going to do such a good job that it's even going to impress the Swiss building inspector. And so he goes to Herculean lengths to clean this apartment. Let's see. And right before the building inspector comes, the main character, he's madly doing laundry for the 50th time, trying to get these sheets clean or something, sheets and pillowcases, and somehow he's concocted such a powerful mix of cleaning products that it permanently stains his finger white. And so then he goes to meet with the building inspector, who is not at all impressed by his cleaning job, and in fact finds some like dirty like washcloths or something in a closet that the main character had missed. I guess I'll stop there. So Anthony, what did you think of Zurich?
I enjoyed it for what it was. I think because it is just this sort of like the Lunatics, but even more so, just a very surreal and dreamlike story. And I think it's short enough that it works. That I'm more willing to. And I mean, I think there's just less going on in terms of like plot. That it was just this kind of fun thing. I mean, I struggled with the narrator at first, who I think he's pretty clear in the afterword is basically just him. Because
I think this whole aside from the finger turning white thing, I think all of this is probably 100% autobiographical.
Right. And he says in the afterward, like, it happened exactly like this.
Yeah.
And I am somebody who, I have also had stayed in temporary places where, there was a really exacting landlord or person who was going to come back and do an inspection. And I did the exact opposite, right? I was like, well, I'll do some cleaning just to make sure that I don't look like a jerk, but I assume they're just going to charge me the cleaning fee and that's fine. And so the idea of, being, I'm going to show them this is going to be so impeccable, I'm going to spend days cleaning, is just completely alien behavior to me. And so I think at first I struggled with that because this guy just seems so weird and hard for me to fathom. But I think when I got onto his wavelength and the wavelength of the story, and then this idea that a lot of his behavior and then the sort of fantastical things that happen are also just kind of an expression of his sadness that this period of his life is over, I think it worked pretty well.
Yeah, well, all the stuff I've described so far I thought was fantastic. Just the before we get into any of the magical realist elements of the story, just the story of this guy who's just determined to show the Swiss that an American can be just as fastidious as they are, I thought was really really entertaining and engaging. And so so then what happens is that this building inspector is unimpressed with these dirty towels that were stuck up in a corner, a secret corner of the closet. And so the main character touches them with his finger that turned white from all the cleaning products, and they sort of magically turn the hand towels, or whatever they are, magically turn white. And so it develops that he's acquired this supernatural, this Midas touch ability to just make things clean and white by touching them. And so he proceeds to kind of wander around the city, testing out his power on different things. And, just sort of touching everything, like the buildings and the people and the bus and stuff, and turning it all clean and white. And I don't know, I didn't like that second sequence quite as much. I thought the idea was fine of this sort of Midas touch thing, but it just, I don't know, it just felt, it felt like overly open to, it was clearly a metaphor for something, but I felt like it was just sort of an overly open to interpretation metaphor in a way I didn't find totally satisfying. But you said something about, there's one line I guess I could read. This is the clearest explanation we get for what the metaphor is. He says, quote, "Everything passed by so fast that you never got the chance to hold it, to touch it, to make it yours. Can't we keep anything? These years of our life, we were happy, we were here, and now it was all white and clean and still, turning to marble under the touch of my hands." So what do you think, Anthony? That do you agree that the story was overly open to interpretation, or did you feel like you had a good handle on what the theme was supposed to be?
I thought it was. I understood sort of tonally and emotionally what the story was, even though metaphorically, why is it white? What is he actually what is it supposed to communicate when he goes around, turning everything white? I guess, yeah, maybe it is something about the idea that he's sort of wiping the slate clean as they leave in this really sad, in a way that's actually quite sad. But I think that's not super clear. And it was interesting because in the other thing, even though it's a very short section in the afterword, the other thing he said was that, after finishing the story, he sent it to his German teacher, who said, "Oh, did you know that actually in these cultures, white is the color of mourning, mourning, MOURN." And
it was Japan. Am I misremembering?
Yes. No, you're right. Well, because there's a lot of different countries involved at this point.
Oh, okay.
Because let me see. Because I think the teacher was in Japan, and yes, in Japan. No, so teacher was not currently in Japan, but he was saying that in Japan and Korea, the white is the color for grief. So I think that it sounds like that wasn't something that Robinson had intended initially, but seems like gives some resonance to the color. I think I cared less about the color or exactly what the sort of metaphorical interpretation was, but what I liked about it was, to me, at this point, when the inspector shows up, and things have already become so heightened in terms of what the narrator has been doing to try to clean this apartment, that it felt right for it to sort of burst into surrealism, and that the remaining, and I think it's a pretty short section, like maybe 3 pages, in a relatively short story, is just in this kind of exuberant tone where everything that's happening is kind of surreal, and then there's this one note of melancholy, which is the segment that you read. To me, emotionally, it worked well, even if I couldn't have fully deciphered the metaphor.
Yeah, I definitely don't have a problem with it becoming, making that turn into magical realism. But I felt like maybe it should have, there should have been some more of a connection between the two movements of the story, that the magical part should have amplified more something that was going on in the mundane part. And to me, it felt like just a little bit disconnected, or a left turn. It starts off where he wants to impress the building inspector, and then it becomes about I don't know how the past recedes into this place we can never, experience again, or something like that. And those two ideas just felt a little disconnected to me. I don't know. I felt like there was some way they could have maybe been unified better.
I think it's also because we know so little about the character. And so, I mean, at least for me, right, I just sort of imagine Kim Stanley Robinson 30 years ago and what I know about him. But in terms of like what's actually on the page, all we know is, living temporarily in Switzerland, obsessed with cleaning. That's it. Like there's like no person, like I love that passage that you read, but it does sort of come out of nowhere. And there's not, I think, there's just no there's no character in which to sort of really imagine those feelings. It's just the language.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we even necessarily needed to know a ton more about the character. I just think like if the magical part somehow became an amplification of the building inspector and wanting to impress him, or like the judgmentalness of building inspector, like it just seems like two different stories almost at that juncture. There's also this thing where he meets this, or he encounters this musician, this like guy is he on a bus, right? He like this guy's playing music on a bus or
a trolley or something like that,
and busking. And so when the main character touches this musician, he doesn't turn white like everybody else did. He just kind of, his colors become a little bit more vibrant or something. Is there any, I mean, I guess I could like fabricate some interpretation of that, but do you think that there's anything in the story that actually points toward any particular interpretation or other of what was going on with that?
Not really. Yeah. I mean, it's because that also stands out because the last sentence of the story is talking about from a distant street, I could still hear that twanging. So clearly that's meant to be, what he wants to leave us with, but why, again, I can tell you that I liked the language and I liked the emotional register, but like what it actually meant, I don't know.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, Kim Stanley Robinson, as we'll see from a story we'll get to later, is obviously really into music. So I would interpret it as somehow like about the power of art or individuality or something to stave off the assault of entropy, or I don't know.
The one thing he'll sort of still take with him when he's sort of forgotten Zurich and left it behind, but he'll still remember that musician, something like that.
Yeah. So, but again, I feel like that's a totally consistent reading, but I feel like I could come up with like 20 other readings that would have just as much validity. So yeah, this is what I'm saying. Like, I just felt like the story was a little too open to interpretation. I mean, maybe if you like that, this might be the story for you. But I just wanted the story to maybe clue me in a little bit more about what it was trying to say. Yeah, I think that's it. Shall we move on to the next story?
Absolutely.
All right. Next story is called Vinland the Dream. And so in this story, I guess in the 19th century, there were a number of Viking hoaxes in North America where people, like created some Viking site or something that wasn't real just to get attention or money or something. And so the only Viking site in North America that's considered to be legitimate is in Canada, and it's called Lanso Meadows. And so Robinson explains in his author's note that he just started to wonder, well, given that there are all these other Viking hoax sites, what if it turned out that this one was a hoax site as well, and there just never had been any real Viking sites discovered in North America at all? And so that's the premise of this story, is that there's this archaeologist character, and he's just proven that this Lanso Meadows site, which in real life, as far as I understand, is a real Viking site, but in this fictional story, it turns out to be just another one of these hoaxes. And so this professor archaeologist talks to the Canadian Minister of Culture and they just sort of have a conversation about what the implications are of this site turning out to be another hoax. So Anthony, what did you think of Vinland the Dream?
I didn't hate it, but I didn't like it. I mean, I think actually we'll get a couple more stories like this where you can tell he's a talented writer. There's interesting scenes, there's interesting texture, interesting characters, but the story as a whole just like doesn't really do anything for me because, going into this, I had no idea what Vinland was. I'm not emotionally invested in the question of whether or not Vikings visited Canada or North America.
Well, let me just explain. So Vinland, from what I gather, is like there are some Viking writings that mentioned a place called Vinland, which means like wine land. And so the speculation is that this is a reference to North, like Vinland is North America, is like the memory in Viking culture of North America. And I think that that's speculative, but I think that's my understanding of what's going on there.
Yes, which I didn't know any of that going into the story. They don't really explain it in the story, so I had to, look it up afterwards. And I think, in as much as it's a speculative story, there is this scene where the professor is just sort of imagining what essentially like what the person who pulled off this hoax, presumably, I guess, in the early 19th century, and just went around fabricating these sites. And that was like interesting to me. And I kind of felt like, well, that, if you want to write a story about this, that's the story. I thought like, again, the professor as a character was interesting. His interactions with the Minister of Culture were interesting, but like in terms of how that fit into this broader idea of, that this whole idea of Vikings visiting North America was a hoax, but maybe that story still has, resonance or value. It all just felt like it didn't add up to much for me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is, and this will be true, I think, particularly of a couple of the stories we'll get to in a minute. Like I was thinking, because Robinson stories, they're always thoughtful and they're always well written. And this was leading me to, the thought popped into my head, like everything's great about these Robinson stories, except the story, except like the plot, like so many of these, like there's a, a high degree of craft and intellect, but just the actual like sequence of incidents is just not something that really interests me. And so that's definitely the case here. This story didn't do much for me at all. I was also not familiar with any of the Viking hoax stuff. So, I was a little bit baffled by that. But I also I didn't really like so this was all kind of building up to this conversation between the professor and the minister about basically whether it matters or not, whether this site was a hoax. And I thought that this was dumb. Well, so what she says is, where's the quote? She says, "History is made of stories people tell, and fictions, dreams, hoaxes, they are also made of stories people tell." And this is, I think, a perfect example of what the philosopher Daniel Dennett calls a deepity. Are you familiar with this
I'm
concept?
not. I mean, it's a term that suggests meanings already to me, but explain what it is.
Yeah, so Daniel Dennett says that a deepity is a statement that at first glance appears to be both profound and true, but that this is a kind of trick, and that it's a phrase that has two meanings. The same words can be interpreted in two different ways, and in one of the ways it's true but trivial, and the other way would be earth-shatteringly profound if it were true, but it's completely false, right? So like history is just a story. Like at one level, it's true that history is like a narrative that human beings communicate from one to another. So in that sense, it's true that history is a story, but that's like everybody knows that and it has no consequence whatsoever. And the other way to read the phrase history is just a story is, history has the same ontological status as any fiction does. And that would be earth-shatteringly meaningful if it were true, but it's completely stupid and false. So I just found this culture minister character sort of annoying. and her her points about, sometimes people can be inspired by stories that aren't actually true. It's like, well, yeah, like I know, like everybody knows that. So the story just overall didn't really do much for me.
Yeah, it's because the way that conversation is written, like I think that also those two statements that you're talking about of like history as a story being sort of trivially true, and then that ontologically it has the same status as like fiction. I think there's like also interesting sort of valences to that in terms of like how those narratives are constructed and what we value. But like this story doesn't get into any of that. It's just like she just kind of says, it's all the same, and then the professor just kind of sputters like, well, but this was a real place. Things happened here. But it sort of is written in this way where either she gets the better of him in the conversation, or at least they seem to be sort of evenly matched in a way where I was like, I think there is an interesting conversation here, but you're not having it.
Yeah, and this is sort of getting into, I think, what's going to be a problem with some of these other Robinson stories we're going to get to, where there's some like interesting philosophical idea or something at play, but a work of fiction is not really the best way to explore this philosophical idea. And so what you end up with is a story that's like 90% underwhelming fiction. And at the very end, it raises some incredibly profound or interesting philosophical point or something, but doesn't explore it in any depth, So like we could have a conversation about it, but the story doesn't go into it, doesn't like bring up really anything that interesting about the philosophical issue that it, sort of points to. So yeah, I don't want to like badmouth the story anymore. Okay. So we can move on. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was kind of interesting finding out about this Viking stuff I never knew about, but that was about it for me.
Yeah, no, I think we can move on.
All right. Okay, so the next story is called A History of the 20th Century with Illustrations. And so in this story, there's a successful nonfiction writer, and his agent calls him. Oh, and he's also, I think, within the past few years, gotten divorced. And so he's like depressed and undergoing some sort of light therapy to try to treat his depression, but it's not really working. And so his agent calls him and says a publisher has offered this £100,000 advance to write a 1-volume history of the 20th century. And this author doesn't really want to do it, but he kind of needs the money. So he reluctantly agrees. And he has written all his books at, it's the British Museum. Do I have that right?
Yeah, the British Museum.
And so he has these friends in London that every book he stays with these friends in London and does all his research and writing at the British Museum. And so he decides to do that again, but his friends tell him that they're going to be away, but he's still welcome to use their apartment. And so he starts doing his research for his book and is just sort of overwhelmed by how bloody and awful the 20th century actually was. And at one point, he comes across a 1-volume history of the 19th century. So it's sort of like an earlier version of the kind of thing he's trying to write. And the book contains this quote, I believe that man is good. I believe we stand at the dawn of a century that will be more peaceful and prosperous than any in history. And so this author is, really struck by how wrong that statement turned out to be, and decides to drive up to Scotland for some reason. So Anthony, what did you think of A History of the 20th Century with Illustrations?
I think it's a lot of kind of what you were saying about Vinland the Dream, and I was saying about Vinland the Dream even more so here, where I think it's like beautifully written, and there's scenes in it that I found like very vivid and memorable. And as a story, I think it doesn't really work. It also reminded me of something that we haven't talked about so much with Robinson, and that I think also has been kind of buried under, the reputation that he has now as this sort of, definitive or authoritative climate writer, that in the 80s he was known as kind of the leader of the humanist science fiction writers, as sort of set in opposition to the cyberpunks. And I'm probably, not doing justice to the argument, but that I think for a lot of the cyberpunks, they said, like people like Kim Stanley Robinson, they write these stories that are often published in Asimov's that could have just shown up in the New Yorker. And I think that is not entirely true in the sense that I think there's a very high bar for getting into the New Yorker. But I always thought that was sort of a parody of what an 80s humanist science fiction story was. But reading this, I did kind of feel that way of just like, the speculative component is that I guess it was set in the very, very near future when the story was written, because it was written in the late 80s, published in 91, and then I guess takes place in 95 or 96 or something. But there's nothing about, it does not seem different in any way from the time in which he was writing. And yeah, it's just like this depressed guy reading about history, which, again, his observations are true. Many things in history, most of history is pretty awful, and most of the 20th century is pretty awful, but it doesn't really have a lot of dramatic force to it. And I think also because you start to ask yourself, well, he's written a bunch of other volumes of history, and it sounds like covering much of the same period. Like, why is this affecting him so much more now? I guess it's because he's depressed, which, we know from other parts of the story. So it's just a depressed guy reading about history and feeling depressed about it. And it's not terrible. It's not like I hated that section of it, but it didn't have any particular emotional force for me. I think the most interesting parts of the story, at least in that first half, were just like the details of him, going to the UK, getting settled in, sort of hints of his life before. He's also, I guess now separated from his wife, but he has these sort of friendships in the UK, but that also seem kind of distant. Everyone's maybe had a bit of a hard time. And so there's this really lovely texture to it, but it doesn't really have a lot of emotional power to it.
Yeah. So that the concept you mentioned of the cyberpunks versus the humanists or new humanists or something.
Yeah.
I think
they were generally just called humanists.
There was a famous essay about this. I think it was James Patrick
it was Michael
Kelly.
Swanwick. I think it was a guide to the postmoderns. Is one of them.
Okay,
at least one of the
Swanwick.
famous essays about it.
Okay. Well, if anyone's curious about that, there's a famous essay that we think is by Michael Swanwick, and it's called A Guide to the
A User's Guide to the Postmoderns.
Postmoderns. Okay. But yeah, certainly my experience of reading this story is that this is not science fiction. Give me a break.
Which is probably the most productive way to read it, except that I saw it was published in Asimov, so I was like, what the hell?
Well, not only was it published in Asimov's, it also appeared in the year's best science fiction.
Okay.
Which is like, what? Come on, this is not science. I mean, I have a pretty I'll take a pretty expansive definition of science fiction, but this is not there's no way that this falls under it. So I don't know. But I mean, as a piece of realistic fiction, I thought this was pretty good. I mean, especially for most of it. I mean, a lot of the stuff a lot of the incidents from the 20th century, from the horrors of the 20th century that he recounts are really interesting. Some of them I didn't know about. And then this trip he takes up to the Orkneys, right?
Mm-hmm.
I thought was fantastic. I mean, as a piece of travel writing is fantastic. I mean, I feel like I've been to the Orkneys. I feel like, I could either go actually go to the Orkneys or read this story, and 10 years later, I would have exactly the same memories of having been to the Orkneys. It's really, really good as travel writing, but it's what is the, again, like I was saying, everything's great about the story except the story. What is the story here?
And how do those two halves sort of fit together, except that it's about one depressed guy? And again, I don't mean that in a dismissive way, but I just think that's sort of the overriding thing about him, is that he's just very depressed.
Yeah. And so I thought it was a terrific, realistic piece of realistic fiction up until the ending, which seemed sort of even by the standards of like literary fiction, seems sort of like a letdown or kind of, unresolved, or didn't really like basically at the end, after traveling around Scotland, he throws out all the notes that he had made for his book and writes down that same line I read. I believe that man is good. I believe we stand at the dawn of a century that will be more peaceful and prosperous than any in history. And so it's a little bit open to interpretation. Is he writing this? Now he's just totally despairing and he's writing this ironically, or is this like, him trying to salvage some bit of optimism, having seen humanity's past preserved still or something? I don't know. It's do you have any strong opinions, Anthony, on what the ending of the story, what we're supposed to take away from the ending of the story?
Not any strong opinions. I guess I did interpret it as more like a gesture of despair, sort of like I give up on trying to like make sense of this, and I'm just going to write this. So sort of like all I can do is sort of repeat this very empty mantra that has not turned out to be true in the past and probably won't turn out to be true in the future.
But why would he just, after seeing like Skara Brae and all that stuff, why would
no idea.
Increase?
I mean, and I think that's part of it. Like, you were talking actually with Zurich about the ideas of the two halves not fitting together. I think that this is also a story where like I can imagine somebody doing all these things, but in what way does it sort of add up into a story? I don't really know. Like it feels like just sort of this happens. There's this first half where he does this and then he feels bad. So he goes on a drive. I can believe that he does that, but like, it doesn't feel like a complete or like the connection thematically. It doesn't feel like a meaningful continuation. It just feels like, again, lots of really interesting, beautifully written scenes that don't quite add up to a story for me.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, this is sort of speculative on my part, but I feel like Robinson just maybe has a tendency to drop autobiographical material into fiction and not really like stir it up that well. It's like, well, there was this thing in my life that really happened to me that has a great deal of emotional resonance to me, so I'm going to plug it in here. And I don't know, like if it necessarily gets, mixed in is the best way I can think to put it with the rest of the fictional material. I don't know. Maybe, I mean, Robinson has a PhD in English, so maybe he could come on and set us straight. But just my experience as a reader was not too satisfying. I was not too satisfied at the end here.
Well, you were also talking about this idea of like, are these the kinds of ideas that are best explored in fiction? And, I would argue that any idea can be explored in fiction if you sort of give it the right fictional form. But I think in both Vinland the Dream and A History of the 20th Century with illustrations, it feels like the intellectual content is just not really dramatized at all. It's just people either thinking about it or talking about it. But there's, it's not really fictionalized in any meaningful sense. It's just people thinking and talking.
Well, I mean, the problem is if you have some philosophical concept that people have spilled oceans of ink over for centuries, like what are the odds that you're going to be able to add meaningfully to that discussion in 3 pages at the end of a short story? Like the whole, this is why I think like fiction is not necessarily the best avenue for doing philosophy, or at least you're discussing philosophy. It needs to do its own thing. We'll get into this a little bit more later, so maybe I'll just put a pin in that for the moment. But yeah, do you have anything else you want to say about History of the 20th Century, or do you want to? Should we move on?
No, let's move on. Okay,
next story: Muir on Shasta. So John Muir was a legendary environmentalist. He was, I think, like co-founder of the Sierra Club, or maybe was involved in the early years of the Sierra Club. I actually spent, my parents were big into backpacking when I was growing up, so I spent a lot of time hiking the John Muir Trail. So his name has always had a certain mythic ring to me, although I don't actually know that much about him other than what I said. But so anyway, so apparently Kim Stanley Robinson, who does know a lot more about John Muir than I do, has taken an event from Muir's life that Muir had written about, where he was up on Mount Shasta with a friend, his friend Jerome Bixby, and it started to snow, and Bixby was afraid to hike down the mountain in the snow and insisted that they had to stay on top of the mountain where there are these kind of like hot springs or something, and that the hot springs would keep them warm, and it was way safer to stay there than to try to hike down the mountain in the snow. And Muir thought this was crazy, but he didn't want to leave his friend alone up on the mountain. So the two of them spent the night kind of like huddled against this hot spring and almost died. And so Robinson has taken this incident and dramatized it in fictional form, and also throws in this kind of like dream or vision or something that Muir has, as he's almost dying of cold, where he sees the past and future of California, and the implication is kind of like inspires him to either get into or get more serious about his environmental crusade. So Anthony, what did you think of Muir on Shasta?
I'm worried. I feel like this section, like these are the stories, that I feel I have mostly similar feelings about, which is that I think they were perfectly fine to read, but didn't quite work for me as stories. Maybe this is slightly more successful, because, it's shorter, and because I think the sort of core narrative about Muir on the mountain is fun and full of vivid details. But the vision that he has really, it just like doesn't do a lot for me. I don't think it was completely ineffective, but fundamentally it just felt like too much for one story, and almost a way to kind of justify this again as something that's mildly speculative.
Yeah, I mean, I liked this more than a lot of the other ones. I wouldn't say that you have to run out and read. I mean, I think most of my interest in it just came from, I think, the scenario that Robinson was riffing on is just a intrinsically interesting situation. This sort of like, mundane backpacking trip that turns into a life or death situation, I just think is sort of intrinsically interesting. This idea of kind of like huddling around a hot spring to survive in the snow, I thought it was kind of interesting. But yeah, like again, like a lot of these stories in the second half feels underdeveloped as fiction. I wonder if there would be some way to amp up the drama a little bit. But yeah, I mean, like in this second half, a lot of these pieces increasingly start to feel more like writing exercises than fully developed works of short fiction. And so this is another one to me that has a little bit of a writing exercise feel to me. But I thought that the underlying material was interesting enough to me that I ended up liking this a fair amount. But yeah, I don't know. That's kind of where I come down on it.
Yeah. It's actually one other thing that, as you're talking about these stories as writing exercises, that reminded me of was the in the afterword to A History of the 20th Century, he also mentioned the fact that I think that was the last story he wrote before starting Red Mars, which is to say he's starting the Mars trilogy. And he said it was basically a decade before he got back to short fiction again. And so essentially, I mean, first of all, that you realize that almost all of these, I think 15 out of the 22 stories, so 17 out of the 22 stories, I think, are like before he wrote the Mars trilogy. So this is all from his early career. And then there's like 5 stories that come afterwards. And so I think there is that basically at that point, he was a really successful science fiction novelist. And I don't think short fiction was really the heart of where his interests and ambitions were. And so there is a little bit of a feeling of a really talented person who's not necessarily putting, it's not that they're phoned in, but just like that's not really like the heart of his creative enterprise anymore.
Yeah, and I would certainly imagine that a lot of these things he was writing, for at the request of some editor or something, and didn't necessarily have a lot of time to devote to the project, but would maybe devote a week or something, or who knows how much time exactly, but would sort of allocate a certain amount of time, but not this wasn't like the main thing he was focused on, like you say.
Yeah. I mean, but yeah, in terms of the Muir story, I did like a lot of the details, like you said, the fact that they had to sort of keep themselves alive by kind of putting their their like legs and other body parts into like really, really hot water. But then when they started to feel like they were really like getting scalded, they had to go back and put their like legs in the freezing air. And I like the sort of that combination of that it is like their lives are at risk, and also there's a kind of grumpiness, and he doesn't seem particularly bothered by the fact, Muir doesn't seem that bothered by the fact that their lives are at risk. Like there's like the fact that they're up there, they kind of stuck up there in the first place is partly because he didn't want to come down, and he lies to his friend about needing to take more measurements or more readings, but he didn't. He just like was kind of annoyed or didn't feel like going down yet. And then when they are in this sequence trying to stay alive, he he thinks about another time when he was temporarily blinded, and he was like, oh, I was so much more scared then than I am now, which is also kind of a funny
for 3 weeks he was blinded.
Yes. I mean, it actually sounds like a very scary thing. I think it's sort of a funny kind of fictional tactic to be like, actually the much more traumatic thing that happened to my character in this story is something that happened way before this story. This is like a much more minor incident in their life. But I liked the combination of those two things, that like he, that on some level he wasn't that worried about it, but also he was very aware that their lives were at risk.
Yeah, I guess that was another thing I really liked about the story was just that Muir himself is a fascinating character. And so like the thing about being blinded for 3 weeks, that was interesting. And also near the beginning, there's this line about how he had been in so many like lightning storms on mountains that he just assumed he would survive through any one, because he'd been, because it was just like old hat at this point. So yeah, there was just like, he was just a really colorful character in that way. And so it did, you could sort of understand how even in this like life or death situation that he would approach it with this certain, aplomb, because he's just, been in so many dangerous situations before. So yeah, that kind of, I think Robinson just picked a good subject matter for this piece. I think maybe could have done more with it somehow as fiction, but
Did you like just the vision?
It was fine. I don't know. It's not even that long. Isn't it only like three paragraphs long or something?
No. But I guess to me that it took on like importance because that's sort of like the one major piece of invention, right? Otherwise, he's basically just describing something that really happened.
Yeah, well, I haven't read. He in his author's note he references the nonfiction essay that Muir wrote about this experience, and I haven't read that, so I can't say how much his dramatization adds to the story. He says something about how he made Muir more annoyed with his friends than Muir admits to being in his essay. But I don't know. The vision was fine. That wasn't what interested me really about this piece. It was more just the situation I thought was in the situation, the survival aspect I thought was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we got a couple more stories to get through. So let's move on to sexual dimorphism. So this is set in the same universe as the like Red Mars books. And so yeah, this is on like Mars. It's been terraformed in the future, and there's oceans and dolphins and stuff, breathable atmosphere. And the main character is a scientist named Andrew Smith, and he's studying genetics. I guess the dolphins that they have on Mars in this future are like descendants from Earth dolphins, so they're a little bit different. And so he's being sent samples of dolphin DNA from Earth to like dig into its, see what he can figure out about the evolutionary history of dolphins. And so that's his work. But then his personal life is complicated because he's dating one of the other scientists and can feel her drifting away from him, but doesn't know what to do about it. And then at some point he confronts her, and she tells him that she's been cheating on him for over a year, at which point he loses his temper and like punches her in the face without even really thinking about it, and is immediately horrified by what he's done, but has obviously totally screwed up this relationship. And all their colleagues find out about this incident, and so everybody, totally ostracizes him. And while he's being ostracized, he becomes more and more kind of fixated on the idea that of sexual dimorphism, which is, the idea that animals, male animals and female animals differ from each other in predictable ways. So like, male peacocks look a lot different from female peacocks for obvious evolutionary reasons. And sort of becomes more and more interested in the idea that is violence in human males just like part of our evolutionary like inheritance / burden, and to what degree is a male who acts violently to blame for his actions, and to what extent is it just sort of his biological nature as a male? So Anthony, what did you think of sexual dimorphism?
I liked it a lot. I thought that the kind of core relationship drama was, I think, just like very well done. And this sense of, that, the Andrew, the scientist, like can tell that things are going wrong, but he like, just like there's nothing. He's almost like this sort of passive observer to this, like the disintegration of their relationship, even though in fact, of course, he's very actively contributing to it. I liked a lot of just like the details of Martian society, and I mean, so I've read the Mars trilogy. I really like the Mars trilogy a lot, and so I don't know how much that informed my reading of this, but definitely I can imagine this sort of increasingly utopian Mars society going on all around this story. I think that the scientific content, I mean, I think a lot of it, as was the case when I read the Mars trilogy, I sort of glazed over and didn't necessarily take it in. The idea that you were talking about, that he is wondering, how much of this is sort of just the violent behavior is inherent to human males, I think is there in the story, but it's sort of underdeveloped. And I think I was okay with that. I guess that was maybe less interesting to me, despite the title, than just sort of the core relationship drama between these people who are scientists. And obviously science is important to their life, but I didn't necessarily think that all the parallels between his work and the relationship drama were that interesting.
Okay. I think you probably liked this more than I did. I thought it was all right. I mean, the Mars setting felt very much in the background to me. Like I could imagine, like I felt like you could take the same story and set it in the modern day on Earth, and it would be almost no different at all. Am I imagining that? Like what was like particularly Martian about this story?
Good, fair question. I think there's like some small things. I mean, I do think part of what gives it the emotional charge for me is what he said in the afterword of just that, like, Mars is, the way that he imagines Martian society in the future is fundamentally utopian. But even in utopia, you could have sort of sad relationship drama like this. So in that sense, that's part of where the resonance came from with me. I mean, maybe if I were like a regular swimmer, all the swimming stuff would seem really mundane, but it also just seemed like really weird and almost science fictional how obsessed everyone is with swimming. I was like, oh, maybe that's just, all these like Martian scientists are just like something about Mars. They're just really into swimming. And then I think also it sort of nodded towards towards the end, where basically like the speed with which he is shunned because everybody knows what he did, I think is sort of implied that like he is rejected to an extent that might not be true in sort of contemporary American society. So, I mean, I think on some level you're right. Like, I think you could transplant the outlines of the plot, certainly the cheating plot, to contemporary America. But I think the fact that it was on Mars made it more interesting to me. But I can see how that wouldn't really be there for you.
Yeah, and so then I also felt like this character, Andrew, like I mentioned earlier that the Glacier, like the plot was a little boring, but I liked the main character so much that it kind of compensated for it. But this was one where I felt like he's just like not that, there's nothing really likable or interesting about him to me. And so, I mean, I felt bad that he was being shunned by everyone. But he just seemed sort of like self-absorbed and depressed. And I thought the story might have benefited if there was just something a little bit more likable or engaging or interesting about him. It got a little bit relentless, just kind of how morose he was for me.
I think you're right that he's just like a very unlikable character for me, because I think with short fiction, I'm more willing to go with it. Just be like, all right, here's this guy who just really kind of sucks, and here are some bad things that happen to him. I resist that more, I think, in novel length or seasons of television. But for a short story, I'm like, sure, that's fine.
Okay, and then my other issue was kind of like what I alluded to earlier with History of the 20th Century. Wait, is that the one we were talking about?
Yeah,
where it's like 90% of the story is this relationship drama, basically, or like social drama, and then pretty much at the end, I mean, I guess there's a little bit threaded throughout, but it basically becomes about this philosophical question of like free will versus biological determinism that's like really, really superficial in its treatment of that subject. So this was another one to me where the big ideas and the fiction didn't really, we're working a little bit at cross purposes rather than amplifying each other.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, again, probably my enjoyment of the story came also from just like kind of glazing over during a lot of that scientific stuff and just sort of not and seeing it more as just like an illustration of his character and what he's interested in, more than a particularly compelling intellectual idea, because I guess I just like fundamentally don't think that violence is something that's like genetic, like every human male is just helpless to the kind of genetic imperative of violence. So that's like not an interesting or compelling idea to me. So I think I just sort of like tossed that out and focused on the relationship drama.
What did you make of the ending?
Again, I'm not going to give you a definitive. I don't know that. I was actually going to ask you the same question. I mean, I think there's the one ending, which I kind of like more, is that literally the dolphins, so he encounters these dolphins and then like he kind of like, I think grabs hold of one, is kind of holding on as they're taking him out to sea, and he starts to freak out. But then he's like, oh, well, they need air too, so this is probably fine. And I think there's one interpretation that he just is about to like drown. Like that's it. Like it's that him thinking that this is going to work out okay for him is not correct. Otherwise, yeah, it's just sort of a kind of mildly arresting image to end on, but it doesn't necessarily seem to tie in thematically with these sort of bigger ideas about gender.
Yeah, it seems super weird to me. I wasn't sure what was going on. It got sort of like dream. Like, well, he has a weird like dream about a chimpanzee raping a dolphin or something. Is that what happens?
I don't remember there being a dolphin in the dream, but definitely there's like, yeah. Like,
wait, I actually have the quote. Okay. The ape turned the dolphin over and mated with her, released her. He left and came back to find the dolphin in the shallows, giving birth to twins, one male, one female. The ape's troops swarmed into the shallows, killed and ate them both. Farther offshore, the dolphin birthed two more. That's his dream.
I stand corrected. Okay, there's the dream.
This I can tell. This dream didn't make much of an impression.
No.
On you.
I mean, it's the double thing of like, I think I was maybe not paying that much attention to his scientific research. And then also, I think in general, dream sequences, I tend not to be as interested in.
Yeah, I definitely thought he was going to drown at the end when the dolphins are pulling him out to sea. It seems like he's just totally lost it, is how it came across to me. But it felt pretty weird and sort of disconnected from, from how he seemed during the rest of the story. But I don't know. So yeah. I don't know. Anything else you want to say about sexual dimorphism?
No, I mean, I think that most of the things you're complaining about, I think, are real problems with the story. I think just the core kind of relationship narrative worked enough for me that it didn't bother me as much as I think it bothered you.
Yeah, well, it seems like you just focused more on the relationship, which is, well characterized, I think, and less so on the science, which is maybe, sort of underdeveloped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Discovering life. So in this story, there's a group of NASA scientists, and they're kind of, watching. There's a NASA mission which has retrieved like a soil sample from Mars, and they've just there's like a press conference reporting on the results of this soil sample, and it turns out that the soil sample contains microbes which are sort of reminiscent of microbes that you would find on Earth in the distant past, which so it suggests there was maybe some panspermia, I think it's called, some transfer of biological material from Earth to Mars or vice versa in the distant past. And the main character, this NASA scientist, is really invested in humans settling Mars, and comes to realize that the existence of these microbes will probably delay, manned missions to Mars, possibly indefinitely, and is sort of struggling with that reality. So, Anthony, what did you think of Discovering Life?
Again, another story where there's a lot of fun details. I mean, this may be actually the most extreme example of what you were talking about, where it's kind of like interesting scenes and characters, and then sort of this little sprinkling of philosophy at the end that doesn't really feel fully justified or developed. So my parents were aerospace engineers in LA. My dad, I think, worked with some people at JPL. I may be misremembering some of the details of his career, but this felt like not exactly the world that my parents were in, but sort of adjacent to it in a way that was kind of nice for me. I mean, I've certainly spent a lot of time sitting in traffic on the freeways in Los Angeles, and so a lot of that stuff felt very alive to me. But that sort of core question of, how does this discovery mean that we're not going to be able to settle Mars? It felt, just very underdeveloped. And then, I mean, particularly like strikingly underdeveloped because this came after he had written the Mars trilogy, where I think the setup is slightly different. I don't remember there being, sort of native bacteria discovered on Mars, but this question of like, how much does Mars exist as, a venue for human colonization, for terraforming, and how much should we let Mars be Mars is kind of one of the main animating questions of all three books. And so I feel like he's like dealt with this debate in a much wider and more developed way. And so this just feels like a kind of weird afterthought in some ways.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. It definitely felt underdeveloped, and again, seemed to not like kind of an interesting idea, but not rendering it as fiction didn't really add much here, I felt.
Like, what's interesting about the story has almost nothing to do with the larger intellectual science fiction idea.
Yeah, and sort of how the story ends is that one of the scientists says, well, I guess, if we can't terraform Mars because of these microbes there, we'll just have to terraform Earth. So there's like kind of a bit of a ecological message there. But yeah, it just, didn't really do much for me.
And sort of comes out of nowhere in that story. I mean, it sort of sets the stage for like arguably everything that he's written since then. But in the story itself, it just kind of comes out of left field and is not developed at all because it's the last sentence of the story.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to the next story, Prometheus Unbound at Last. So this was published in Nature, which is one of the two big scientific journals. Like my dad finally got a piece into Nature after like decades of science, and it was like a highlight of his career. That's how prestigious Nature magazine is. But they also do this. They have this feature called Nature Futures, where they publish little pieces of science fiction at the back of the magazine. And I think it's a cool idea, but for whatever reason, they have like a 800 word limit or something. So all these things that I've read, I have not found very satisfying because it's hard to do much in 800 words of fiction. And so anyway, so this is one that Robinson was asked to contribute, and he also in his author's note talks about the difficulty of doing anything interesting fictional in 800 words. And so his approach that he settled on was to write an imaginary, like if you were to submit a book to a publisher and the publisher had people reading the submissions and writing little reports for their bosses on what the book was about and saying whether they thought it should be published or not. He writes this imaginary reader's report describing a novel where, let's see, there's like a world's court rules that like the future, the value of the ecosphere in the future is so massive that all the polluting companies and everything are going to have to pay in some way to offset the damage that they're doing to future economic value. And this funds some like global body of scientific organizations who somehow convince everybody to revert to mostly a Paleolithic lifestyle with some technological augmentations, such as dentistry, and then everybody lives happily ever after. That's what I took away from this. Anthony, does that sound approximately correct to you?
Yes. Though it really does not like do any justice to how weird the experience of reading this story is. Like, if you didn't know that he was trying to fit this into 800 words, you would just be like, why did you write it this way? This doesn't and in the afterword, I mean, he doesn't say that much, but there's sort of this tone of like, okay, I figured out I have come up with a solution to this problem of how to tell the story in 800 words, which is to do essentially, a summary of this imagined novel. And that is, I appreciate that he's trying and that it's a big challenge. I don't have any idea what I would do in that situation, but that is not a solution to it. He has not solved the problem. This is, you're just like, this, no. And well, and also because it's, again, not identical, but in a lot of ways, the scenario that he's describing here is ultimately a book that he did write, the Ministry for the Future, which is about the idea of, it's also a very strange novel because it in many places it's not really a novel at all, but just sort of like a policy document of here is how we combat climate change, and let's create this organization whose job it is to advocate for all the humans of the future who are getting screwed over by the decisions we're making now in terms of climate. And so that is just a much more in-depth treatment of these ideas that are sort of just kind of sketched out very, very loosely here.
Yeah, I mean, my impression reading this is that it reads like a private joke, and Robinson says in his author's note like that this piece makes him laugh every time he reads it, which makes one of us. Uh, yeah, it just seems it just seems like somebody making a joke that I wasn't in on was kind of like how it came across.
Because the tone is not just this happens, but it's like this sort of knowing kind of like publisher inside of me, like, oh, this chapter is in the tone of a zombie novel. This chapter is like this, but it's like none of it is particularly funny, or there's not enough detail to give any of that side of it real life.
Yeah. So, didn't do much for me. Like, to be fair, like I said, like all the other 800-word nature things that I've come across, I wish that they would loosen those restrictions somewhat, at least make it like 1,500 words or something. Then you would at least have a little bit more room to work in. But all right, so let's move on to the last story in the book. It's called "The Timpanist of the Berlin Philharmonic, 1942." And so in this story, this is a real concert that the Berlin Philharmonic played in 1942 for Hitler's birthday. Most of the members of the orchestra were, anti-Nazi, but they were forced to play this concert. And so that's told from the point of view of the timpanist, and just sort of like exploring his feelings about, being forced to play this concert that he doesn't want to play in the city that's probably going to get, destroyed or invaded soon. And that's basically what the story is about. So, Anthony, what did you think of the story?
So kind of similar to Glacier, this is a story that my opinion changed as I read it multiple times. And I think partly because with a number of these stories, there's this feeling I have, especially knowing that he's a science fiction writer, knowing that many of these stories are published in, genre magazines, like waiting for the kind of genre element to come in, or at least some sort of plot, right? And so for this whole story, I think the first time I'm sitting there being like, okay, what happens at the end of the concert? It's all building to something. And then reading it the second time, knowing that it's really not, at least not in a plot sense, building to anything. It's really just a description of this sort of imagined emotional state of the timpanist, and then more broadly, just sort of the people in the orchestra who, are not supporters of the Nazi Party, are arguably sort of complicit with it because they're still there. They haven't fled, but are trying to find, eke out some measure of like dignity, of still like doing the right thing, standing up for, like, in some cases, like the Jews in the in the symphony, and sort of then like using the kind of container of the concert and the movements of this piece as a way to just sort of describe the mindset, and what it might feel like to, be like kind of hating what you're doing, but also wanting to do it well, but also trying to use it as a way to sort of express, not in words, but just sort of with like feelings and music, the feeling of being in Nazi Germany at the time. I actually thought it was like the second time I really loved it. I thought it's a story I really, really liked once I let go of the idea that anything was really going to happen.
Which is a good thing to let go of going into any Robinson story.
Yeah, exactly. I think that also just generally improved the experience of reading a lot of these stories, is when you're just like, okay, no spaceship is going to come down. There's not going to be some sort of big, revelation. Maybe somebody will think big thoughts, but that's about it for a lot of these.
But stories. You agree that this is not science. Is there any debate about whether this is?
No, I don't think this is science fiction. No.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is he wrote this story specifically for this book. Like a lot of times, publishers would prefer it if they're putting together a short story collection, if there's something original to the book, to give people an added incentive to pick it up. And so I think that was this for this book.
And it sounds like he also maybe was writing, or at least started writing it at Clarion. Maybe he was teaching. And he doesn't go into a lot of detail, but I sort of imagine that there's this sense of, hey, I'm telling all the students that they've got to write and get a story critiqued in a week. Let me see what I can do in a short period of time too.
So I thought the stuff that you were talking about, the, like just how does it feel to be playing a concert under these horrible circumstances in this, in this city that's under siege and stuff. I thought that was all really interesting, and I did like the. I was just going to. This is just one of the main sections of the story that express what you were talking about. He says, quote, "People would look at the film and listen to the tapes and hear this music and take pause, see birds in a cage, hear that not everyone had been suborned, that some had to stay and fight from within as best they could with whatever they had, even if it was just to make a music that would remind people hunched by their radio that there was a better world." So I thought that was a beautiful sentiment. All that stuff I liked just fine. My issue with the story is that it goes into immense detail about describing what it's like to listen to every section of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And I don't know how other people feel. For me personally, I don't know if there's anything I find more boring than than reading a description of someone listening to a piece of music. So I really had a hard time getting through this. But if that sounds like your cup of tea, you might like this more. I mean, there's no question that Kim Stanley Robinson loves Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and is interested in writing about it in enormous detail. But sort of like his descriptions of some other things that he's interested in writing about in enormous detail, like geography and rocks and things like that. I'm not always along for the ride.
Yeah, I mean, just hearing you talk about that reminds me. I mean, there are definitely things in these stories that I sort of glazed over, and for me, one of the main memories of reading his books, particularly Red Mars, is there's just long descriptions of either Martian landscape or the science of terraforming that I just, no matter how many times I read it, I can't retain it, and I just sort of realize that you just have to sort of actually, for me at least, I enjoy it more when I don't read those sections too carefully, because and I just sort of let it kind of wash over me and hopefully get the important stuff. I think. Well,
see, let me just say, this is my curse as a podcast critic, is because if I'm going to be discussing something on the podcast, I feel honor bound to read every word, pay close attention to every sentence, so that I'm doing my best not to miss anything. So if there's something that's too long, it feels way too long to me. Whereas, a more casual reader might just kind of skim over that paragraph and not stress over it too much.
Yeah, I mean, and I do think that fundamentally, I think that there's a lot of descriptions in virtually all of his fiction that could be cut, I think that's probably true here. Maybe it bothered me less here because it was also from the perspective of the timpanist, and so it was not just at least in my memory, it's not just here's what the music sounds like, but it's here's what this section means to the timpanist, here's what it means to other members of the orchestra, here's how he's going to have to perform it, and what he's trying to communicate. And so that there's a narrative and character to it, not just here's Kim Stanley Robinson trying to describe the music.
No, it's really well done. I just feel again, there could have been a less is more approach.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think there's probably they could probably stand to be cut a bit.
Yeah, I don't have any problem with the story containing any descriptions of what the music sounds like or what the orchestra's goals are and any of that stuff. I just felt there was way too much of it. A little a couple examples would have given me all the flavor that I personally needed to get into that part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, but it probably also just bothered me less than it bothered you.
Yeah. All right, so we're way over time here. I did want to do our top 5, but let's do this as fast as we can.
Okay.
So I'm going to assume number 1 is the Lucky Strike for both
Correct.
of us.
Yes.
Yeah. Lucky Strike was far and away my favorite, not even close. So yeah, that's definitely number 1. I think we're going to have a lot of differences
Yes.
based on the conversation we just had on the rest of these. But why don't you give me your number 2?
I think my number two was I've been going back and forth on this. I'm gonna say a sensitive dependence on initial conditions, and I should say that I do think that for me, it's something where it's like number one is like there's a big gap between one and all the rest of the stories, whereas I think 2 through 5 could kind of be in any order. But yeah, sensitive dependence on initial conditions, which I think was like I still found like very interesting, even though it I think doesn't work at all as a story unless you've read The Lucky Strike first.
Yeah, I thought it was all right, but not one of my favorites. But yeah, I know you definitely like that one more than I did. My number two is Glacier. Like again, just I liked the characters so much that the fact that it's sort of a quiet story where not a lot happens didn't really bother me that much. So I'm putting that as my number two. So how about what's your number three?
My number three is The Timpanist of the Berlin Philharmonic.
Okay. Yeah. Also not on my list.
Yeah, it's
as you may have guessed.
No. I mean, I think like just the emotion of it really. And I should say that I just finished my reread like an hour before we started recording. So and I remember like not liking it the first time. The second time it just totally blew me away. So maybe on the third reread it wouldn't rank quite so highly, but right now it's like still kind of reverberating for me.
Yeah, and maybe I've only read all these stories once, so maybe if I were to read any of them a second time with more, with more reasonable expectations or more of an idea of what I was getting myself in for, I might, my opinion might change. But for number three, I have Before I Wake. This is the story we talked about last time. That is like basically a Philip K. Dick story about the whole world just gets into a state where people are dreaming and waking and dreaming and waking and they can't control it. I thought it was really creepy and cool. And so those first three I just mentioned, Lucky Strike, Glacier, and Before I Wake, those are all like definitely my top three. And then the other ones I could kind of put them in any order. But so Anthony, what's your number four?
My number four is Before I Wake.
Okay.
So, yeah, I like that one a lot. I also liked Glacier a lot. I mean, Glacier, I think, was going to be in my top. It was in the original version of my top 5, but then when I read The Timpanist, I decided I like that considerably more.
Okay. Yeah, I shifted around my top 5 as well. So, but yeah, so number 4, I have Muir on Shasta. Have a feeling this one's not going to be on your list. But
correct. Yeah. But
again, I think just the character of John Muir and the survival situation was compelling enough to me that I to put it into my top 5, even if I feel like probably the story didn't do as much with it as fiction as it maybe could have.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your number 5?
My number 5 is another one that I think you did not like, which is Escape from Kathmandu. That one I've only read once, so maybe on second reading I would agree with you that it's too long and kind of tedious. But in my first reading, I was like totally entranced, thought it was hilarious, laughed out loud once or twice, and I thought it was delightful.
All right, cool. Yeah, and then my number 5 is The Blind Geometer. Again, that we talked about last time. I thought the ending was a huge letdown, but for 80% of it, I was really, really into the story. And that was enough to win it a spot in my top 5. And then honorable mention, I have Black Air. I shifted around to my 4, 5, and 6 a bunch, but Black Air could have easily ended up in spots 4 or 5 as well. So I'll mention that one as well.
Okay, yeah. Then my honorable mention would be Glacier. Then. Okay.
All right. Cool. All right. So we got a little overlap there, but yeah, like definitely.
And I don't think we were surprised that there was some disagreement either.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like, I like The Lucky Strike, I think everyone has to read. And again, as I mentioned last time, you can get it in this PM Press edition where it's, you don't have to get the whole Kim Stanley Robinson thing just to read that one story. And then these other stories, like, I think they're fine. I wouldn't. I certainly wouldn't dissuade anyone from reading them, but I also wouldn't be like, "Oh, you got to go read Glacier. You got to go read Before I Wake." So I think overall, I would have to say I did not connect with the best of Kim Stanley Robinson as much as I expected to, or sort of hoped that I would.
Yeah, I mean, after our first episode, I was starting to like second guess myself, and I was like, "Wait, were we being too hard on this?" And I think that where I've ultimately come down is that if this was just a collection of short fiction, by say like a new writer, I would read this and be like, "Oh, this was pretty good. Like, there's a lot of talent here. I think there's be some distance to go." But the fact that it's a best of, and that it's a best of by one of the most prominent writers in the field right now, it does feel a little like, oh, like you kind of had like, if these are the best, like what's not making the cut? Because I didn't, there are very few stories that I hated, but like some of them just feel totally like tossed off, and writing exercises. I wouldn't describe all of it, but definitely sort of maybe the bottom 25% of this, like a lot of them do sort of feel like writing exercise. And I think that fundamentally, if you're trying to get into Kim Stanley Robinson, this is not the book I would recommend, because it does feel like the kind of core of his achievement and of his focus in the last few decades has been the novels.
Yeah, and I said, last time that my impression is that Kim Stanley Robinson is the most important living science fiction writer. But so I was definitely not expecting, a best of collection to have as many misses for me as this one did. I'm looking forward to reading his novels, which I think is, I think, as you're saying, where his strength probably lies. But yeah, so I mean, like the other, like the other books we've covered, like the best of Roger Zelazny, Harlan Ellison's Greatest Hits, the best of Greg Egan, the best of Larry Niven. All those books I would recommend as, books, unreservedly. I loved them all. I mean, I didn't love every single story, but there were, such a high proportion of hits to misses that I would recommend reading all those books in their entirety. This one I felt like is just for, Robinson completists, and particularly toward the end, there were just a lot of stories that didn't work for me. So I would have a hard time recommending, like endorsing, this book as a whole as something that people have to run out and read.
Yeah, I feel the same way, and not because I disliked reading it, but just because if someone was asking about it, I'd be like, well, have you read the Mars trilogy? Have you read the Ministry for the Future? If you've read those and you just want more, then maybe I would give this to you, but it seems like they're much better places to start.
Yeah, and I said, last time that the science fiction novel I'm most looking forward to reading someday, once I have time to read something that long, is Aurora, and I am still really looking forward to reading that. I just think maybe at the novel length, writing a short story plot is a particular skill, and fitting a whole plot into a short story, and the novel is a much more forgiving form, I think, when it comes to plot. And so, I remain optimistic that I will love Aurora when I read it. So I'm holding on to that optimism.
Maybe we should do a book club episode.
Yeah, no, definitely. Once I have time to read a book that long, we should definitely do a book club episode. Because everything I've heard about it makes it sound really, really cool and interesting. So everyone can come back for that when we do that. Anthony, any final thoughts on reading the best of Kim Stanley Robinson?
No, I mean, I think the best. I'm glad I read it, and the best stories in it are very good. And it's not where I would start. Yeah,
but again, The Lucky Strike, definitely. I do recommend that one unreservedly. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. So to end things on a positive note, I will just reiterate, everyone should check that out. All right, but so let's wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Anthony Ha about the book, The Best of Kim Stanley Robinson. So Anthony, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks again. Talk to you soon.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Anthony Ha for joining us on the show. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.